Welcome to Communicate to Lead, the podcast that empowers leaders and aspiring leaders to communicate with clarity and impact. I'm Kele Belton, CEO and successful entrepreneur, and your host for today. I'm here to equip you with all the essential tools and strategies to master effective communication and lead your team to success. As the founder and CEO of The Tailored Approach, my goal is to empower you to be the best leader you can be. So sit back, relax, and join me in today's episode as we dive into the art of communicating like a true leader. You know the meeting I'm talking about, the one-on-one where you walked your manager through your recommendation. You'd done the work, you had the data, and your manager nodded along the entire time. They said, "This is smart." They said, "I can see the value here." And they may even have said, "I'm behind you on this." And then came the leadership meeting, the one where it counted, the one where your recommendation needed a voice at the table, but you weren't in the room to be that voice. Your manager was, and your manager said nothing. Or maybe he said something that wasn't entirely convincing. Or worse, they presented a watered-down version of it. Or they let someone else's weaker idea take the oxygen. Or they mentioned yours with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. And when it got pushed back, they folded. You found out later the way you always find out. Secondhand, a colleague mentioned it in passing. The decision went a different direction. And you sat there with a question you couldn't say out loud. You agreed with me. Why didn't you back me? If you've lived some version of that moment, this episode is for you. Because here's what you need to know right at the top. You don't have a persuasion problem. You already persuaded them. What you have is a conversion problem. And today, I'm going to show you exactly how to convert private agreement into public advocacy. Welcome back to Communicate to Lead. This is episode 181. And today we're talking about one of the most quietly frustrating experiences in a high-performance career. The manager who agrees with you behind closed doors and goes silent in the rooms where decisions actually get made. This one has been on my mind because of a pattern I keep seeing in my coaching work. The women I work with aren't losing because their ideas are weak. Their ideas are winning. They are fantastic. They are winning in the one-on-one. They're losing in the handoff, in that gap between the private yes and the public silence. And almost nobody talks about that gap because from the outside, it's invisible. Your manager looks supportive. You look like you've been heard, and yet the outcomes tell a different story. So today, we're taking that gap apart. First, we'll look at what's actually happening when your manager agrees with you in private and stays quiet publicly, because the explanation is almost never what you fear it is. Then I'll give you a way to diagnose which of the three types of non-backing you're dealing with, because the fix depends on the type. And then we'll get to the conversation itself, the specific way to convert a private yes into a public voice without demanding, without confronting, and without spending an ounce of your credibility to do it. You've already done the hard part. You won the argument. You got the private yes. Today is about making that win count where it matters most. If we're meeting for the first time, I'm Kele Belton. I'm a communication and leadership coach, and I work with high-performing women in middle and senior management who are doing excellent work and are still being overlooked when it comes to promotion. This podcast is where I share the strategies and patterns from that coaching work so you can put them to use in your own career. And if you've been here for a while, welcome back, my friend. You already know how much I love a topic like this one. Quick favor before we get into it. If this show has been useful to you, the single most powerful thing you can do is leave a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It takes about 30 seconds and it's how other women leaders find the show. Thank you so much in advance. Okay, let me tell you about a client I'll call Naomi. She's a composite of several women I've worked with. No one single person is being described here, so I'll put it out there. But I promise you the pattern will feel familiar. Naomi is a senior product leader at a growing company. Sharp, respected, consistently ahead of the curve on where her market is going. Last year, she spent weeks building the case for a shift in her team's product strategy. She brought it to her manager in their one-on-one. Her manager loved it. Direct quote, as Naomi remembers it, "This is exactly the type of thinking we need. I'll raise it with the executive team." 3 weeks went by, nothing. Then Naomi learned through a colleague that the executive team had discussed strategy. Her manager had been in the room, and her proposal had come up for all of 90 seconds before dying quietly. Her manager hadn't fought for it, had essentially placed it on the table and stepped back. Naomi's first instinct was the one most of us have. She turned the lens on herself. Maybe the idea wasn't as strong as she thought. Maybe she'd misread the enthusiasm. Maybe she needed to make a better case. And I stopped her right there because that instinct, as understandable as it is, points the analysis in exactly the wrong direction. The idea already succeeded. The one-on-one was the test of the idea, and the idea passed. What failed happened after the handoff, in a room Naomi wasn't in a calculation her manager was making that had very little to do with the quality of Naomi's thinking. So let's talk about that calculation, because once you see it, you can never unsee it. When your manager agrees with you in private, they are evaluating one thing. Is this idea good? That's a low-stakes question. It costs them nothing to say yes in a room with 2 people in it. When your manager considers backing you in public, they are evaluating something entirely different. What does championing this idea cost me? Now their reputation is on the line. Now they're spending their own political capital. Now, if the CFO pushes back, they must decide in real time whether to hold the line or retreat. The private yes and the public backing are 2 separate transactions, each with its own price tag. And most of us were never taught to see them as distinct. Here's the reframe I offered Naomi, and it's the one I'm offering you now. When your manager agrees privately and goes quiet publicly, it is almost never a verdict on your idea, and it is almost never personal. It's a risk calculation you weren't shown, which means your job isn't to re-argue the idea. You won that already. Your job is to change the calculation. And you can. That's the whole second half of this episode. But first, you need to know which type of non-backing you're dealing with, because there are 3, and they need 3 different responses. So let's walk through the 3 types of non-backing, one at a time, along with how to recognize each one when you're living it. The first type is the risk-averse ally. This manager genuinely agrees with you. They want your idea to win, but they've done the math on the room and decided the political price is higher than they're willing to pay right now. There's a reorganization in the air, or their own standing with their boss is shaky, or the idea steps on the toes of someone they can't afford to cross this quarter. Their agreement is real. Their courage is budgeted. You can recognize the risk-averse ally by what happens after the silence. They stay warm. They keep engaging with the idea in private. They may even apologize in a vague, uncomfortable way. Maybe they say something like, the timing wasn't right. The room wasn't ready. They're telling you the truth in fragments. They wanted to back you and calculated they couldn't afford to. That's the first type. The second type is the passive agreeer. This manager said yes in your one-on-one because it was the easiest thing to say. Not because they were lying, not exactly, but because private agreement is cheap and they spend it freely. They nodded because you were persuasive in the moment, but the idea never truly became theirs. It never went inside them. So when the idea came, there was nothing pushing them to speak because they were never carrying anything to say in the first place. You can recognize the passive agreeer by the shallowness of the follow-up. They don't ask questions after your one-on-one. They don't request the deck or the data. The idea doesn't come up again unless you bring it up. Their yes was a social gesture, not a commitment. And the silence in the meeting wasn't a betrayal of the commitment. There was never a commitment to begin with. The third type is the ownership vacuum. This one surprises people and is most common of the 3. The manager agrees with you and is willing to speak, but they don't know what to say. You gave them a conclusion in your one-on-one, but you didn't give them the tools to defend your idea. So when the moment came and someone asked a tough question, they had nothing in their hands, and silence felt safer than fumbling. Think about what you handed your manager after that one-on-one. Did they walk away with the 2-sentence version of the case? Did they know the strongest objection and the answer to that? Did they know what you were asking the room to decide? If the answer to any of those questions is no, then your manager went into that meeting as an unarmed messenger. And unarmed messengers go quiet the moment the room gets hard. Here's why the diagnosis matters so much. If you treat a risk-averse ally like a passive agreeer, you'll come across as doubting someone who's genuinely on your side, and you'll damage a relationship worth keeping. If you treat an ownership vacuum like a risk problem, you'll spend energy on reassurance when what your manager actually needed was a briefing. The response has to match the type. With Naomi, we worked out that her manager was mostly type 3, with a thread of type 1. He believed in the proposal. He also walked into that executive meeting carrying a vague memory of a good conversation and nothing else. When the CFO asked about the revenue implications, he had no answer. So he did what people do when they have no answer. He moved on, which brings us to the conversation that changes all of this. And this conversation is what I call the conversion conversation. It is how you turn a private yes into a public voice. It has 3 parts, and I'm going to walk you through each one using the exact language because the words matter here. Before I give you the language, though, one honest calibration, because not every listener is working in the same conditions. Everything I'm about to walk you through assumes a manager who can hear a direct conversation without punishing you for it. Many can, some cannot. You know your manager and you know your culture. So here's how to think about it. If the relationship can carry directness, run the full conversation the way I'm about to describe it. And I'll add it to the show notes so that you have it and you can grab it. If you're genuinely unsure, or if experience has taught you that candor gets held against people in your organization, skip the backward-looking piece entirely and start with the forward-facing moves instead. The advocacy brief and the specific ask, which you'll hear in part 3. Those require no conversation about what went wrong. They quietly change the conditions for the next meeting, and the results will teach you plenty. And if even that feels risky, notice what that's telling you, because we're going to come back to it before the episode ends. Okay, so here's the first part of the conversion conversation. Remember I said there were 3 parts? Here's part 1. Hear the account first, then name the gap without accusation. What you're going to do is bring up what happened directly and calmly, because the alternative is letting it happen again and again on a loop. But remember something important from the way this usually unfolds. You weren't in that room. What you know arrives secondhand through a colleague, through the grapevine, through the outcome itself. So you're not walking in to prosecute a case. You're walking in to compare notes, and then to describe a gap you both have an interest in closing. So the language sounds like this. I want to talk about the product strategy proposal. In our one-on-one, you were behind it, and that meant a lot to me. My understanding is that it came up in the leadership meeting and didn't move forward. I wasn't in that room, so before anything else, I would love to hear from you how it actually landed. And then you listen. This step matters more than it looks for 2 reasons. First, secondhand information is almost incomplete. The account may change your read of what happened, and you want that correction before you build anything on a wrong foundation. Notice the phrasing too. My understanding is. You're not naming who told you, and you're not claiming to know more than you do. Second, their answer is itself a diagnostic. A manager who gives you a straight account of a tough room is showing that the relationship can carry honesty. A manager whose account is vague or flatly conflicts with what you know is showing you something as well. You're learning either way. Once you've heard the account, then you name the gap. And here's how you can start. That is really helpful. Thank you. Here's what I'm noticing. There's a distance between how we align in private and how that alignment shows up in the rooms that make decisions. And I'd like to close that. Notice what the sequence does. It respects that you weren't in the room. It gives your manager the chance to fill in what you couldn't see. It states the gap without a single accusation, and it defines the problem as shared, not personal. Nobody gets defensive at that framing because there's nothing to defend against. And hold on to what you heard in that account, because if it was vague or it didn't square with what you know, that observation is going to matter later in this episode when we talk about the difference between a gap and a pattern. So that's part 1. Here is part 2. Ask the diagnostic question and then go quiet. This is where you find out which of the 3 types you're actually dealing with instead of guessing. The question you are going to ask is, when it came up in that room, what would have made it easier to champion? And then you stop talking, let the silence do the work because the answer tells you everything. If your manager says something like, honestly, the timing was delicate, or there were dynamics in the room you couldn't see, you're dealing with the risk-averse ally. If they get vague and can't quite reconstruct the meeting, you may be looking at the passive agreeer. And if they say something like, when the numbers question came up, I didn't have the details. That's the ownership vacuum. And that's the easiest one of all to solve. That's part 2. Here's part 3 of the conversion conversation. Arm them or ask directly, depending on what you heard. For the ownership vacuum, the fix is brief. And this is where your preparation becomes your power. After any one-on-one where your manager agrees with something you want to carry forward, send what I call the advocacy brief. It's short, 3 parts. The 2-sentence version of the recommendation in language they can repeat word for word. The single strongest objection they are likely to hear with the answer and the specific ask, what you want the room to decide. 5 minutes of writing that converts your manager from an unarmed messenger into an equipped advocate. 3 parts. So there you have it. The first part is the 2-sentence version of the recommendation. The second part is the single strongest objection they might hear and giving them the answer to that. And then the third part is the specific ask. What do you want the room to decide? Naomi started doing this, and the difference was almost immediate because her manager had never lacked willingness. What he lacked was ammunition. For the risk-averse ally, the move is to lower the cost of backing you. Sometimes that means offering to present the idea yourself with them in a supporting role. You could say something like, would it help if I presented it directly and you framed why it matters? Sometimes it means asking for backing in a smaller room first, where the political price is lower. And sometimes it means the direct version of what would need to be true for you to feel able to champion this fully. That question respects the calculation while making it discussable. And a calculation that can be discussed is a calculation that can be changed. For the passive agreeer, the move is to raise the cost of an easy yes, not by confronting them, but by making the agreement specific. At the end of your next one-on-one, instead of accepting a nod, ask, so when this comes up on Thursday, can I count on you to make the case with the timeline piece specifically? A vague yes can dissolve. A specific commitment made out loud to a named action in a named meeting is much harder to quietly abandon. You're not manipulating anyone. You're converting a social gesture into an actual agreement, which should have been that in the first place. One more thing about this conversation, because it matters, you might be tempted to skip it, to decide it's safer to work around your manager, to find other champions, or to let this one go. There are situations where finding additional champions is exactly right. And we've talked on the show about building a network of sponsors for that reason. But hear me on this. The manager who agrees with you in private is the closest thing you have to an advocate already in the room where you aren't. They're 80% of the way there. The conversion conversation is how you claim the last 20%, and it will almost always cost you less than building a champion from scratch. Now, I'd be doing a disservice if I ended the strategy there, because there's a version of this situation where the conversion conversation isn't the answer, and you deserve to know how to recognize it. Everything I've given you today assumes your manager's silence has a workable cause, a missing brief, an unspoken risk calculation, an agreement that was never made specific. Those are gaps in the machinery, and gaps in the machinery can be closed. But sometimes the silence isn't a gap. Sometimes it's a pattern, and patterns tell you something different. Here's how to tell the difference. A gap responds to the conversion conversation. You name the pattern, you ask the diagnostic question, you arm them or make the agreement specific, and the next time something changes. Even a partial change counts. Your manager speaks up or tells you honestly why they can't, or works with you on a different path. That's a manager worth continuing to invest in. A pattern looks different. You've had the conversation more than once. You've sent the briefs. You've made the agreements as specific as possible. And the silence continues, wrapped in fresh explanations each time. The timing is never right. The room is never ready. And meanwhile, you notice that the manager finds their voice easily enough when the idea on the table is their own, or when the person being championed is someone else. If that's what you're seeing, the message is not that you need a better brief. The message is that this manager has decided, for reasons they will never say out loud, that advocating for you is not something they are going to do. And you cannot brief your way past a decision. What you can do is stop rooting your advancement through a single closed door. That means widening your circle of champions deliberately, building relationships with your skip level, making your thinking visible in rooms your manager doesn't control, through cross-functional work, through written channels, through the senior stakeholders who see your contributions directly. Not as a workaround born of resentment, but as the strategy it always should have been. No leader's advancement should depend on one person's willingness to speak up. And notice the sequence here because it protects you either way. You run the conversion conversation first. If it works, you've claimed an advocate. If it doesn't work, after a genuine attempt, you've gained something almost as valuable: clarity. You now know exactly what this relationship can and cannot carry, and you can plan your next moves on real information instead of hope. Either outcome moves you forward. The only losing move is one most people make, which is staying silent about the silence and absorbing it month after month as a quiet verdict on themselves. Remember my client Naomi that I mentioned at the beginning of this episode? Let's close the loop on her. She had the conversion conversation with her manager. She named the gap without accusation. She asked the diagnostic question and let it sit. And her manager, to his credit, was honest. When the CFO pushed on the numbers, he didn't have them, and he wasn't going to wing it in that room. So they built a system. After every one-on-one where something needed carrying forward, Naomi sent him an advocacy brief, 2 sentences of recommendation, the hardest objection answered, the specific ask. And before big meetings, they take 5 to 10 minutes to align on exactly what he should say and what he needed from her. That proposal that died in 90 seconds, it came back 4 months later, reframed, briefed, and armed. Her manager presented it with her revenue analysis in hand, and when the CFO raised the same concern, he answered it in 1 sentence because the sentence had been written for him, and the proposal, as you guessed it, was approved. But here's the part I care most about. Naomi told me that the biggest shift wasn't the win. It was realizing that her manager's silence had never been a measure of her value. She'd spent months quietly absorbing that silence as a verdict on herself. It was never a verdict. It was a gap in the machinery. And once she could see it, she could work it. That's what I hope you take away from today. The silence in that meeting is not a verdict on you. It's a system with a missing part, and you are entirely capable of supplying that part. So here's your action step for this week, and it comes in 2 sizes depending on where you are in your career. If you have a live version of the situation, an idea your manager agreed with that hasn't been championed, schedule the conversion conversation. Use the framing from today, grab it in the show notes, name the gap without accusation, ask what would have made it easier to champion, and listen for which of the 3 types you're hearing. Then respond to the type not the silence. If you don't have a live situation right now, build the habit before you need it. The next time your manager agrees with something you want to move forward, send the advocacy brief within a day. The 2 sentences version, the hardest objection with the answer, and the specific ask. 5 minutes of writing. It's the highest leverage 5 minutes in your week because it converts every private yes you earn into something that can survive a room you are not in. If today's episode hit close to home, if you've been winning the argument in private and watching it evaporate in public, I'd love to talk with you. I offer complimentary leadership strategy calls, 30 minutes, no pressure, no pitch. We look at where you are, where you want to go, and what it will take to get you there. Sometimes the gap is a conversion problem like the one we covered today. Sometimes it's something entirely different. Either way, you leave with clarity. The link is in the show notes. Until next Monday, my friend, I'm Kele. Remind you that great communication is the foundation of inspiring leadership. Keep learning, keep growing, and remember to communicate to lead.